Have you ever had one of those moments that seemed completely ordinary, until a single glance changed the way you looked at your family forever? Imagine walking down a quiet hallway late at night, thinking about nothing more than saying goodnight to your child, only to open a bedroom door and find something that instantly fills your heart with confusion, fear, and questions you never expected to ask. What would you do? Would you walk away and pretend you never saw it? Or would you step inside, knowing that whatever happened next could change your family forever? Today's story is an emotional family story about love, trust, and the quiet moments that often hide the biggest secrets. It isn't about dramatic action or impossible events. It's about the emotions that many parents understand but rarely talk about. Sometimes the hardest truths don't arrive with loud voices. They appear in silence, in a dimly lit room, in a single unexpected moment that refuses to leave your mind. For years, I believed I knew my son better than anyone else. I watched him grow from a curious little boy into a thoughtful teenager. Like every parent, I worried about him, celebrated his achievements, and tried my best to create a safe home where he could always be himself. Life wasn't perfect, but we had routines that made us feel close. Every night before going to bed, I would check on him, remind him that I loved him, and quietly close his bedroom door. It became a simple family tradition that neither of us ever questioned. But lately, something had changed. He had become quieter. Conversations that once lasted for hours had turned into short answers. His smile seemed forced, and he often disappeared into his room earlier than usual. At first, I convinced myself it was just part of growing up. Teenagers need space. They become more independent. Every parent hears that advice. So I tried to respect his privacy, even though something deep inside kept telling me that there was more to the story. Then came the night that changed everything. The house was unusually quiet. The clock had already passed bedtime, and everyone else had settled into the peaceful silence that usually comes at the end of a long day. I walked down the hallway like I had done hundreds of times before. Nothing felt unusual. I wasn't expecting answers. I wasn't expecting trouble. I simply wanted to say goodnight. As my hand reached for the doorknob, I noticed something strange. The light under the door flickered for just a second before becoming still again. It wasn't enough to alarm me, but it was enough to make me pause. I smiled to myself, thinking he was probably still reading or watching videos before bed. I gently pushed the door open. What I saw froze me where I stood. For a moment, my mind couldn't make sense of the scene in front of me. My son looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't guilt. It was something far more complicated, something that instantly told me this wasn't just another ordinary night. My heart began racing as dozens of questions filled my mind. Why hadn't he told me? How long had this been happening? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do next? That single moment shattered the comfortable picture I had built of our family. Everything I thought I understood suddenly felt uncertain. The silence between us became heavier than words, and I realized that the next decision I made could either bring us closer together or push us further apart than ever before. As the truth slowly began to unfold, I discovered that the real story wasn't just about what I saw in that room. It was about the hidden emotions, quiet struggles, and unexpected choices that had been growing inside our home long before I opened that door. And the deeper I looked, the more I realized that nothing was as simple as it first appeared. Stay with me, because what happened after that night challenged everything I believed about being a parent, about trust, and about the people we love the most. The answers were waiting behind that bedroom door, but they came with consequences I never could have imagined. I stood there for what felt like forever, even though only a few seconds had passed. My son didn't say a word. He simply looked at me, waiting for my reaction, while I tried to understand what I had just walked into. The room looked normal at first glance. His books were stacked on the desk, his backpack rested against the chair, and the familiar family photos were still sitting on the shelf. Yet something about the atmosphere felt completely different. It was the kind of silence that made every little sound seem louder than it really was. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Over the years, I had learned that the quickest assumptions often lead to the biggest mistakes. So instead of asking a dozen questions all at once, I took a slow breath and quietly stepped inside. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as possible. He nodded almost immediately, but it was the kind of answer that didn't match the expression on his face. His eyes kept drifting toward one corner of the room before returning to me, almost as if he was worried I might notice something he wasn't ready to explain. That tiny detail stayed with me. Parents notice things that other people miss. A change in someone's voice. A forced smile. A pause that lasts just a little too long. Those small moments rarely mean anything by themselves, but when they begin to add up, they tell a story. Looking back, I realized this wasn't the first unusual moment. Over the past few weeks, there had been little changes that I had brushed aside because life was busy. Now they all came rushing back. He had started eating dinner more quickly than usual, often saying he had homework to finish. He spent less time talking about school, even though he used to tell me funny stories about his day. More than once, I had walked past his room and heard him speaking softly, only for everything to become silent the moment I knocked. At the time, I thought he might simply be chatting with friends online. It seemed like a normal part of growing up. But standing there that night, those memories no longer felt ordinary. I wanted to ask him what was really going on, but something told me that pushing too hard would only make him close the door emotionally, even if the bedroom door remained open. Trust is fragile, especially between a parent and a growing child. Once it's broken, rebuilding it takes time. So I smiled gently, wished him good night, and stepped back into the hallway. But as I quietly closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story had only just begun. Whatever my son was carrying, it was heavier than I had ever imagined, and somehow, our family's future had become tied to a truth that was still waiting to be uncovered. The next morning felt different in a way I couldn't explain. Everything looked the same, the kitchen, the breakfast table, the usual sounds of daily life, but something inside me had shifted. I kept thinking about the moment I opened his door, replaying every detail again and again, trying to find meaning in things I might have missed. When my son finally came out of his room, he looked like he had barely slept. He avoided eye contact at first, quietly sitting down at the table without saying much. I tried to act normal, like nothing had happened the night before, but the silence between us was heavier than usual. Even the simple sound of a spoon touching a bowl felt louder than it should have. I asked him how he slept. He nodded. One-word answers again. The same pattern was returning, and it was becoming harder to ignore. There was something going on in his life that he wasn't ready to share, and I could feel the distance growing even while he was sitting right in front of me. Later that day, I noticed something else that made my thoughts spiral again. He kept checking his phone more than usual, quickly locking the screen whenever I came near. It wasn't just teenage privacy anymore. It felt like he was carrying a responsibility he didn't want anyone else to see. At one point, I heard him speaking quietly in his room again. This time, I stopped outside the door longer than before. His voice sounded tense, careful, like he was choosing every word very carefully. I couldn't understand everything, but I caught fragments that made my heart sink a little. I wanted to go in. I wanted to demand answers. But something stopped me again. Instead, I walked away slowly, realizing that whatever was happening inside my son's world was not something I could force open. And that realization scared me more than anything else, because sometimes, the things we don't understand are the ones closest to breaking us apart. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my son's face from the moment I opened his door. The way he looked at me. The way he quickly tried to hide something from my sight. It all kept repeating in my mind like a warning I couldn't fully understand. I told myself I was overthinking, that maybe it was just teenage stress or school pressure. But deep down, I knew this was something deeper. Around midnight, I heard a soft sound from his room. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes even small noises feel louder than they are. But then I heard it again. A faint movement. Like someone trying not to be noticed. I slowly got up from my bed. My heart was beating faster as I walked down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. The same hallway I had walked through thousands of times now felt unfamiliar, almost like I was entering a place I didn't fully know anymore. His door was slightly closed. Not fully shut. Just enough for a thin line of light to escape into the darkness. I stopped right outside. For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to turn back, to convince myself that nothing unusual was happening. But another part of me couldn't ignore the feeling that something important was happening behind that door, something I was not supposed to see, but somehow needed to know. Then I heard his voice again. This time clearer, but still low and tense. He wasn't alone. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't knock. I just stood there, frozen, trying to understand what I was hearing. Every second stretched longer than the last, and my mind began filling in questions I wasn't ready to answer. And just as I reached for the doorknob again, preparing to open the door one more time, I heard something that made me completely stop in my tracks. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about my son, my home, and the truth I had been trying so hard to avoid. I stood frozen outside the door, my hand barely touching the doorknob, when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a voice. It was a sentence, clear enough to shake me completely. It sounded like my son was talking to someone about things I had never heard before, names, plans, and something that felt serious enough to change everything. But what struck me the most was the tone in his voice. It wasn't the voice of a confused teenager anymore. It was controlled, careful, almost like he was trying to hide fear while pretending to stay calm. Then there was another voice. Soft, calm, unknown. My mind immediately tried to make sense of it. Was it a friend? A teacher? Someone from school? But none of those explanations felt right in that moment. Something about the way they were speaking made my stomach tighten. It wasn't casual conversation. It felt planned. Intentional. Like they had been waiting for this moment. I stepped closer without thinking, trying to hear more clearly, but the floor creaked under my feet. The sound was small, but in that silent hallway it felt like an alarm. The voices inside the room suddenly stopped. Silence. A heavy, complete silence. For a few seconds, nothing moved. No footsteps. No words. Just stillness, like the entire house had paused. Then I heard my son's voice again, but this time it was different. He sounded alert. Nervous. "Did you hear that?" he asked. My heart dropped. Before I could even move away from the door, I heard footsteps inside the room approaching slowly. I quickly stepped back, pretending I was just walking past the hallway. My pulse was racing so fast I could barely think straight. The door opened slightly. A thin line of light spilled into the hallway. My son stood there, looking at me again. But this time, his expression wasn't just surprise or confusion. It was something else, something that made it clear he knew I had been standing there longer than I should have. Behind him, I could see movement in the room. A shadow shifting, as if someone had just stepped back out of sight. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked quietly. But before I could answer, I noticed something on his desk that I hadn't seen before. Something that didn't belong in his room. Something that made my thoughts spiral in a completely new direction, raising a question I wasn't prepared for at all. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about secrecy anymore, it was about something much bigger than I had ever imagined. My eyes stayed fixed on the desk, even though my son was standing right in front of me. For a moment, I forgot everything else, the hallway, the silence, even the tension in his voice. There was a small folder there, slightly open, with papers neatly arranged and a pen resting on top like someone had been working carefully, not hiding something illegal or dangerous, but planning something important. Before I could ask anything, he slowly stepped aside. His expression changed. The nervousness was still there, but now mixed with something else, relief. "Mom," he said softly, "you were never supposed to find out like this." I didn't understand what he meant. My heart was still racing, but I forced myself to walk into the room. The unknown voice I had heard earlier was now clear. It came from a laptop on his desk. The screen was still on, showing a paused video call. On the other side was a man I didn't recognize at first, someone calm-looking, probably in his late 30s. My son looked at me and took a deep breath. "I've been talking to him for weeks," he said. "He's a school counselor from a youth support program." My confusion deepened. A counselor. All the late nights, the secrecy, the whispers, it didn't add up with what I had been imagining. He slowly picked up the folder and placed it in my hands. Inside were printed pages, notes, and plans. Not secrets of trouble, but plans for something I never expected. He had been preparing for a student mental health awareness project at school. He was helping other students who were struggling silently, the same way he once struggled but never told me about. I didn't want you to worry, he continued. And I didn't know how to explain it without sounding strange. I thought if I told you little by little, you might stop me before I could finish it. The weight I had been carrying for days suddenly shifted, but not completely disappeared. Relief mixed with guilt, because I realized how quickly I had assumed the worst without understanding the full picture. But just when I thought everything was finally making sense, my eyes caught something else in the folder, a letter at the very bottom. It wasn't part of the school project. It had my name written on it. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. My son looked away, as if he wasn't ready for me to read it yet. And in that moment, I understood that even though one secret had been revealed, there was still something he hadn't told me. Something deeply personal. Something that had been building quietly all along, waiting for the right moment to come out. I slowly opened the letter with my name on it, feeling my hands shake more than I expected. The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the same heavy silence from before. It felt softer, like something important was finally ready to be understood. The first line was simple, written in my son's handwriting. He said he didn't know how to tell me everything in person because he was afraid I would misunderstand him, just like I almost did that night. As I read further, I realized the letter wasn't about fear or hiding mistakes. It was about feelings he had been carrying for a long time. He wrote about how he had been struggling silently with pressure at school, not just academic stress but emotional stress he didn't know how to explain. He mentioned moments where he felt alone even when surrounded by people, and how he started talking to a school counselor because he didn't want to fall deeper into that silence. He also wrote something that made me stop reading for a moment. He said he had been trying to become someone who could help others who felt the same way he did. That was why he had been working so hard in secret, planning a mental health awareness project to support other students who might be suffering quietly. Then came the part that broke me a little inside. He wrote that he didn't tell me everything because he didn't want me to think I had failed as a parent. He thought I would blame myself for not noticing his struggles earlier. But the truth was, he didn't want blame, he wanted to protect me from worry, just like I had always tried to protect him. I put the letter down and looked at him. For the first time in days, I really saw him not as a mystery or a problem to solve, but as my son who was trying his best to handle emotions far bigger than his age. I walked closer and hugged him tightly. He didn't pull away this time. Instead, he finally relaxed, like he had been holding his breath for too long. "I'm sorry I assumed the worst," I whispered. He shook his head. "I should have just told you. That night, we didn't fix everything. But we talked. Really talked. About school, pressure, emotions, and how silence can sometimes create more distance than truth ever could." The story of this emotional family moment didn't end with perfection, but with understanding. And sometimes, that is enough. Because true family bonds are not built on knowing everything at once, but on learning how to listen when it matters most. And I learned something I will never forget. Sometimes the doors we fear opening don't reveal secrets meant to break us, they reveal truths meant to bring us closer.